My name is Elise Worthy. I am from Seattle, live in Portland, and I'm moving back to Seattle in 1 week. Today is actually my last day at Living Social. I was part of the Hungry Academy program with Joan Scheffler, who presented yesterday. It was an amazing program, 5 months of intense developer training, and I've worked for the past 7 months as a developer. But I decided to take the next 6 months off to focus on my health. Since the beginning of my life, I've always focused on brain endeavors, not body endeavors. So I'm really excited to see what I can do athletically instead of mentally. And Jessica.
Hi, my name is Jessica Lynn Suttles. This is the face that I use on the internet, and I tweet at JL Suttles. I live in Santa Monica, California, part of Los Angeles, and with my 2 cats, Wabi and Sabi. And I really love being a software engineer, and I'm currently employed at G5 here in Bend, Oregon. I work remotely from LA. And the most exciting thing I've done there lately is I started writing a microformats 2 processor, or parser. If you don't know what microformats are, you should look them up. They're essentially HTML classes that add more semantics to your markup.
Awesome. Okay, so we'll get started. I'm going to talk about the history, while Jessica is going to talk about more recent history and the future of women in computing. The one point that I want to drive in today is that women made programming what it is today. Regardless of what you know about programming, if women had not been there, we would not be programming in Ruby. And they did that in the face of serious inequities, socially, culturally, particularly in the United States. So that's my one takeaway. Hopefully some of you watched Rocky and Bullwinkle when you were little. I will be your Dr. Peabody to Sherman. Just picture me as a small dog with glasses, especially if I get really nervous. So we're going to hop in the Wayback Machine and go way, way back to the 1800s. Computing had pretty simple roots. This is a loom, and if you can imagine living in the early 1800s, most of your needs were pretty basic. So technology was pretty basic too. The first real punch card computer was a Jacquard loom, and it was made in 1801, and it brought in the idea of a punch card. Now this was very, very simple. There was no additional logic or anything related to the punch cards. It just guided the loom to do different patterns. But in the 1830s, that loom idea with the punch cards was adapted to the analytical engine. Now, the analytical engine was never completed in its time. It was only a theoretical idea. But some of you hopefully know of Ada Lovelace. She was one of the programmers on the analytical engine, along with its primary designer, Charles Babbage. Now, Ada is incredibly important because Ada wrote the first program. The first program. I mean, this is huge. So the analytical engine, although it was just an idea at the time, brought on the first programmer. Now, I really like the story of Ada. Ada was the daughter of Lord Byron. If anyone is into poetry, you know that Lord Byron is a particularly famous early 1800s poet. And I just love that he wrote all about emotion and stuff about the heart, and then his daughter is an awesome, brilliant mathematician and logician. Of course, he did not, he didn't stay with Ada's mom, so some of those sappy, sentimental vibes, I guess, did not get passed down. But Ada was a pretty saucy character. I said that the analytical engine was not completed in its time. That is because they ran out of money. So Ada and Charles were really entrepreneurial, and their startup just ran out of funds. What I love about Ada and Charles is that to fund the project, they decided, since they were so brilliant, to go and try their luck at the horse races. And they lost all their money. So that's why the analytical engine wasn't completed at its time. And Ada even had to pawn all of her jewelry and belongings to stay out of debt. So not only was she the first programmer, she was one of the first entrepreneurs taking pretty big risks. I didn't mention the analytical engine was Turing complete, had integrated memory. This was really advanced stuff for its time. Unfortunately, computing didn't progress that quickly. It was mostly innovation due to the Industrial Revolution with industrial applications like we saw with the Jacquard loom. But things started picking up for women and for computing in the early and middle 1920s. In the 1920s, hopefully you've all heard of the women's suffrage movement. Imagine that women in the United States couldn't vote until the 1920s. So imagine our position related to technology and innovation. So just voting rights and property rights were very limited to women at that time. So computing, though, really picked up again in the United States in the 1940s. And something that I don't really like, but is just part of our history, is the reason it really got pushed forward was because of World War II. Before World War II, in World War I particularly, we still used very old school, on-the-ground military techniques, but in World War II we had the technology to further our military goals. So I'm not happy about that, but that's just history. Also particular to women around World War II was that World War II called in the majority of the men for active service. So if you know of Rosie the Riveter, in 1942 there was a program called Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. And it meant that women could come in and fill traditional men's jobs. In the 40s, even if you were a highly educated woman, like you had a doctorate in physics or math, the best you could think of doing was maybe a professor position or a teacher. Most women held secretary positions. They didn't have a lot of options. So in some ways, this was a great leap forward for women and their ability to do different kinds of work in the United States. So there were lots of advertisements for women, do a man's work. So particularly this was related to service for the military. Among the women that were brought on for WAVES, the Voluntary Emergency Service, were some of the first computers. And the computers weren't physical machines, they were people. The first 6 programmers of the ENIAC were hired by the Navy as physical computers. They were mathematicians, but then came on to work with the ENIAC. I think if you remember one person from my talk, I hope it's Grace Hopper. Grace Hopper was one of the women that was involved in the Women in Voluntary Service movement. She was a PhD in math and physics at Vassar and was a professor there. So she decided that the tenured professor track was really boring. She was kind of a crazy insubordinate kind of person, and so she decided to join the military and help out. I guess that's kind of a oxymoron, right? But one of the cool things about Grace is because she was so well educated, when she joined the military, she was higher up in rank. And some people have proposed that because the military has such rigid protocol related to rank, that she faced slightly less insubordination and sexism because of her high rank coming in. So I thought that was kind of cool, regardless of your opinion of the military. So most of the stuff that Grace did that I find really interesting was actually post-war. Grace decided that she didn't want to go back to Vassar and teach, that she would stay in military. And this was a really crazy move for post-war demobilization. Everyone was encouraging women to go back to their old positions. Men would fill the positions that they were in. But she said, no, fuck that, I'm going to stay in the military. And she stayed in and started the Harvard Computation Lab as an active member of the military. After Harvard, she went to Remington Rand, which is sort of just this old school American manufacturing company, but they did the UNIVAC. They also manufactured guns and typewriters and shavers, just kind of that good old American metal company, I guess. But while she was there, Grace is really incredible. She became the director of automated computing, and she wrote the first compiler. The first compiler. Now imagine being in Grace's position in the early 1950s, where basically all the programmers think that computers are just big calculators, you're only going to write a machine code, and she's like, no way. I think we can be way more efficient. I think we can do these really incredible things with computers. She got a lot of resistance, but finally pushed that idea forward. You also might have heard of her as the mother of COBOL. In her position at Remington Rand, she wrote some of the precursors to COBOL and was one of the main people involved in COBOL. So again, she wrote one of the first high-level languages. Hello! This is amazing! And so COBOL, obviously Fortran and Lisp were put out around the same time, but it was only in like the same 3-year period. So you can imagine sort of this innovative leap from crappy low-level machine code to high-level languages. And I found this really interesting piece of data. Even as of the late 1990s, 80% of all code was written in COBOL. Even 50%, I don't have any squiggly underline yet, but 50% of new apps were written in COBOL, and 95% of finance data was in COBOL, which is kind of why the Y2K issue was there. But, I mean, this is pretty incredible. 40 years later, one of the first programming languages was still around. Cool. So imagine, here's some assembly code for a hello world. Imagine being in this situation. I mean, imagine that if someone hadn't made that dramatic leap, we could still be writing this. And here's that in COBOL. So imagine going from just really, really, machine code to such a big leap. And then, of course, now we get to do what we do. But it wasn't all sunshine and roses. These women really faced incredible problems in their careers. In the 1950s, in particular, I found this ad from Remington, and this was the company that Grace was a director at. Can you imagine what kind of hardship she faced given the idea of what women should do at the time? And then here's another ad from IBM around the same time. I don't see any ladies in that picture. And are you glad we're not doing whatever they're doing now?
Slide rule.
Things might have turned up a little bit in the 1960s. we started getting engaged in the space race in the late 1960s. Here's Walter Cronkite talking about it. There were a lot, again, there was a manpower shortage, so women had the opportunity to do different types of things. Jobs for everyone. You know, we're going to beat the Russians. We're going to go into space. There was a huge focus on science and technology. So there were more opportunities for women, sort of. This article was in Cosmo in the late 1960s, and if you read it, you can find it online. It is so it's repulsive, but it really explains the times. It says that you should consider computer programming as a job because it's just like planning a dinner party. Yeah. And actually, Grace Hopper is quoted as saying that. So, but yeah, I mean, if that's what you have to say to get people in, I don't know. So it was a really crappy time. However, women were sort of encouraged to come in some limited capacity. But what really happened was that the programmers were almost all men. They sat in an upper level story of the office building, wrote their programs, and then once a day, someone would wheel a cart down with all their handwritten programs, and the women would have to key punch them in for the computers. And so this is a picture of key punch girls down in a basement, just basically doing the secretarial and data entry work. So not exactly the environment that I would like to be in. But things started to change, and Jessica is going to talk about how those things changed. But with the women's liberation or second wave of feminism, with the second wave of feminism, women started speaking out against limited reproductive rights, job issues, family issues, all those embedded cultural expectations that were just pretty yucky. And so in the 1970s, I'll pass it over to Jessica. Thanks.
I realized that I forgot to mention during my intro that G5 is hiring, so if you're looking for something new, come talk to us, and if you're not, come talk to us, maybe we can change your mind. So in the 1970s, the wave of feminism really took hold. This had started in the 60s, and women started to gain a lot of rights. The 70s marked the 50th anniversary of the women's suffrage movement and the passage of the 19th Amendment. The Equal Rights Amendment was designed to further those rights and had passed in both houses of Congress, and it went on to states for ratification. The Supreme Court also ruled on Roe versus Wade and constitutionalized abortion. So the 70s was pretty awesome for women. And this graph is going to be a reoccurring theme in my talk. I'll reveal more as time goes on. But basically, percentage of women earning bachelor's degrees in selected fields. These are mostly STEM fields. So the very bottom line there is engineering. And above that, we have physics. And the line that we really care about is that green dashed one, which is computer science. And you can tell that there is an upward trend in all of these lines during this period. This is in big part thanks to the feminist movement. It increased women's awareness that they wanted to have a professional career and that they could do it in these traditionally male-dominated fields. Computer science was very new and exciting at this time, so you can tell it kind of like shoots up a little higher than the other ones. Key woman of this time was Adele Goldberg. She was a researcher at Xerox PARC, and she played an instrumental role in defining small talk. Earlier, Evan Light said that Alan Kay developed small talk, but it was really a team effort, and Goldberg was very instrumental in that. And it's an object-oriented, dynamic reflective language, which might sound familiar. It's a lot like a language we use today. In case you don't believe me, here's a quote from Matt saying that he was influenced by Smalltalk. Also, Smalltalk really paved the way for GUI interfaces. A lot of the things that they developed would later be seen in Mac apps because Steve Jobs got a tour of Xerox PARC and got a little first glimpse at what Smalltalk was doing. But personal computing wasn't really a thing yet. Computers were still expensive, and most people interacted with computers through arcade games. This was the golden age of the arcade game. And I'm sure you remember Pong, some other really great games like Asteroids and Space Invaders. And then came the 1980s. Unfortunately, some ground that was gained by the feminist movement was lost in the 80s. The Equal Rights Amendment that had passed in both houses of Congress failed to be ratified by the states by the deadline, so that never ended up passing. But women did continue to enter the workforce and undergraduate programs. Interestingly, they also started to disassociate themselves from their marital status with their name. So they started keeping their maiden name, and they also started using Ms. instead of Mrs. or Miss. And also Sandra Day O'Connor was the first woman appointed to the Supreme Court in the 80s. And personal computing really took off. You guys might remember the Commodore 64. We were a little young for it. And in the first half of the 80s, we continue to see a rise in all these fields. More women are entering these fields, which is awesome. Key woman of the time is Elizabeth Feindler. She works as an information scientist at the Stanford Research Institute, and her and her group helped define the top-level domain names of the internet, .com, .gov, .org. And you remember Adele Goldberg? She served as the president of the ACM during this time. Woohoo! But then something happened. You'll notice the green line, the one we care about, kind of diverges from the upward trend of the rest of them. So women stopped entering computing, but they kept entering other science fields. And some ideas behind this are that when computer science was a very young department, it kind of arose out of a very diverse set of departments in different universities. But as it matured, it found its home more in the engineering department, which you'll notice is the bottom line on this graph, where there are the least number of women. We also start to see the rise of gender in gaming. So before we just had Pac-Man, now we have Mrs. Pac-Man and Pac-Man. And we start to see video games where there's a male protagonist and a female damsel in distress. And this is also visible in Super Mario Brothers and countless other games. And games really start to become more of everyday life, especially now that we can carry them around in our pockets.
Yes.
And this is the Game Boy, by the way.
Oh.
And we also start to see the emergence of the male nerd in popular culture. You might remember these guys from The Revenge of the Nerds. So then the 1990s come along. Some awesome things happen for women. 1992 is actually called the Year of the Woman. This is a record number of women being appointed to high office in the United States. Hillary Rodham Clinton was First Lady, but she traveled the world as a representative of the State Department. Madeleine Albright was the first U.S. Secretary of State to be a woman. Janet Reno is the U.S. Attorney General, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg becomes the second woman on the Supreme Court. Woo-hoo. And we also see the rise of third waves of feminism. And just to be clear, the rise of feminism, the different waves, it's not just about popularity, it's actually different ideas that drive them, but that's outside of the scope of this talk. Unfortunately, before when we saw a rise of feminism, there was an increase in the number of women in computing, but that does not happen this time. This is a really great study that started in 1995. Jane Margulies is a social scientist, and she's interested in gender and education, and Alan Fisher is the founding dean of Carnegie Mellon undergraduate computer science program. And they're interested in understanding why there is a gender imbalance in the program. So a couple years into the research, they changed some of the admission standards. Their research was that they interviewed over 100 students, male and female, throughout 5 years, throughout their course of study there. And after they changed some admission standards, which included, they kept the high GRE scores, but they put more focus on leadership qualities, and they dropped prior experience in programming and added catch-up courses. And they went from 7% females in the computer science department to 42% in 5 years. None of those changes were gender specific. They also saw a huge rise in the retention rate of women. After 2 years, normally only 40% were left, but after 2 years, 5 years later, it was around 90%. And into the 2000s, women are still leaving computing, but the male nerd stereotype gets makeover, but it's still not really something that attracts women, especially things like this. But women continue to do awesome things in the computing world. Fran Allen was the very first woman to win the Turing Award, which is essentially the Nobel Prize of computing. This award had been given out 40 years before it was given to a woman. And she got it for her work in high optimization computing. And just 2 years later, Barbara Liskov also won the Turing Award for her work in programming language design. You might recognize Liskov from the Liskov substitution principle, which is part of the solid design principles of object-oriented programming, first introduced by Michael Feathers. Woohoo! And on to the present. Just recently, Etsy, followed by 37 Signals and Yammer, offered grants for women to attend the Hacker School in Manhattan. The school was free, but living in Manhattan is not. And they also encouraged women to apply and made sure that they reached out to women and made sure that women got the message that they should apply. And they saw staggering results. So the bar on the left is before the grants, and the bar on the right is after the grants, and the green is women, red is men. So people who applied to the program. So they were not able to accept everybody, but they got a lot more applications. And there's awesome programs like Rails Girls now that reaches out to women. They focus on women, but they don't exclude men. Men are still welcome at these events. Women are just given priority. And they're generally 2-day events with an installation party and then 1 day of like building a Rails app. And I attended one of these events in January. It was an awesome turnout. Turns out if you invite women specifically, tons of them come. That's true. And we also had a great coach turnout, which meant that there was very small teams, and this is me working with 2 individuals helping them build Rails apps. And you don't have to be a woman to teach these things. You just have to be interested in helping women learn. RailsBridge is very similar to Rails Girls. I haven't actually participated in RailsBridge, but there was one here earlier this week. I hope some of you went. I was working. Woohoo! Yes! Girl Develop It is a broader reaching, wider focus. They don't just do Rails, they do HTML, CSS, JavaScript, all kinds of things. And there's tons of these programs out there, and they are all over the country, and in some cases all over the world. So if you're interested in helping women get into computing, please find something. And if you can't find something in your area, start something. So all of these organizations make it really easy for you to start a chapter of your own. So we all know that software engineers are shaping the future. And a woman's place is really in the revolution. Woo!